Informed Sources is made possible in part by Susie and Pierre G. Villery.
With a lifetime of passion for public television, we are pleased to help underwrite Informed Sources.
Please join us in supporting WYES TV.
Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, being a victim of a crime is one insult. Having to pay expenses for being violated is another. That has been the experience of some carjacking victims who've had to pay to get their car back from being towed. The city has tried to help, but the cost is bigger than expected. We'll look at the latest on the crime, including an interview with a carjacker. In Kenner, the council wants the mayor to resign. The mayor says he will not. And in Orleans, investigations continue of the Sewerage and Water Board. There is good news. It is Carnival time, and the parades are rolling, though not without some controversies. Also, we will hear some perspectives from one of our panelists who once visited Ukraine. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL TV, Channel 4; and David Hammer, also investigative reporter for WWL TV, Channel 4. And let's go on over first to Mike. You've been doing extensive reporting about the carjacking situation in the city of New Orleans, and actually recently you had an interview with a carjacker, a young carjacker.
And let me tell you the origins of that. I was following this crime trend. It is one of the more unnerving crime trends we've seen in New Orleans in a while, and that's saying a lot in a high crime city. But carjacking is taking place any time of the day or night, any and all neighborhoods. And we've seen victims, run over by their own car, carjacked with a child inside. So it has really everybody on edge. And the actual sort of raw numbers of carjackings have gone up 300% from 2019 to 2021. Now, anecdotally, we were able to look at arrests, and it seemed that a majority of the suspects were juveniles. And in fact, some juveniles were behind some pretty harrowing crime sprees of 4 or 5, even 6, carjackings, going from victim to victim, just stealing one car and then going to the next victim and taking yet another car. So I decided to do a deep dive to kind of get to the bottom of what was behind this trend and whether, in fact, it was juveniles perpetuating the majority. And I did get the statistics that showed of the arrests, juveniles outnumber the adult suspects 2 to 1. So it is in fact, being the surge being led by juveniles. And I ended up speaking to some juveniles who are familiar with what's going on. This is a crime that is a little different than the kind of organized crime you might see with drug trafficking for profit. There is almost no profit motive other than, what might be in that car, a wallet, a purse, and of course the, bonanza would be a gun in a glove box, or, for example. But the cars themselves are not going to chop shops. They're not, being shipped out of town for profit. They're literally almost a form of a menacing joyride. And in talking to these kids, I kind of set an ambitious goal of getting one of them to sit down and tell from his perspective just what is in the mindset of him, who had been involved in a carjacking himself, and many of the peers. And sure enough, we found that it's impulsive, very spur of the moment, that some of the kids don't necessarily realize the gravity of what they're actually doing. And there is, in fact, we were able to show some examples of this, and one very heartbreaking example of a revolving door. When juveniles are arrested, even in this type of violent crime, juvenile court often does not detain these kids, and the law changed in 2.5 years ago, raised the age, now has all 17-year-olds being prosecuted as juveniles. And so many of these 16 and 17-year-olds continue to get arrested and arrested again, and you kind of hear from cops, oh, we keep arresting the same people over and over. It is actually true, and that adds to the mindset that there's not a lot of consequences. Hey, even if you got the max, upon conviction, juvenile life would be until age 21. So it's not putting a lot of fear in the kids who, these aren't often solo, crimes, but kids run in a pack. They may very recklessly, go from, like I said, car to car, crime to crime, without a lot of police presence. We know the tremendous strain on police manpower.
Right. So the person that you talked to, or the number of carjackers who you did talk to, are you finding that that's what they believe, is that really nothing's going to happen to me if I do this? In terms of the law?
That seeps into their mentality. It is not as well thought out. They're not making a calculation, but just sort of the general sentiment is somebody rolls up, hey, jump in a car. And that's what the kid that I interviewed, that's what happened to him. He had missed his school bus. Some people he knew said, jump in a car, no questions asked. Next thing you know, he's smoking narcotics. He's going into an unfamiliar neighborhood. The car gets shot up by some rival group. And police come. He ends up, going to juvenile lockup. And it was a huge alarm for a kid who hadn't been in much trouble up to that point. And there are some cases like that. Now, there's a different, I guess, type of juvenile, the ones who are willing to pick up a gun and point it at the victims in order to take a car. That's certainly more menacing. But the bottom line is the whole city is on edge over this, and both the police department, and we saw this come up, even the city council got involved with hearings holding the criminal justice system, players' feet to the fire. Not a lot of answers, not a lot of solutions on what to do. Little by little, though, you've seen some change in policy by the district attorney's office and, juvenile court weighing in to try to at least slow the revolving door, to show some, consequences. But, what is always so tricky with juveniles is that these are not hardened criminals that are going to remain locked up for a long time. You almost have to go to the root causes of family, school, and put both things for them to do, other than the idle time that might lead them to jump in a car, or some kind of mentoring to get them on a better track.
Provide services for them. Okay, Mike.
And that's lacking, sorely lacking in New Orleans.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. Let's go on over to David now, and some political fireworks over there in Kenner with an election right on the horizon.
Yeah, it's very important to keep this all in perspective, Marcia, and that is that there's two different things happening here. One is there's an election coming up March 26th, and Mayor Ben Zahn is in for a very, very tough re-election battle against the police chief, Mike Glazer. And that's the backdrop for all of this, but it appears that there's some real significance to an FBI investigation that we first heard about last fall, where revolving around the garbage contract in Kenner, which went through a sudden switchover. Ramelli Waste was replaced in early 2020 by Sidney Torres' firm IV Waste. And now there are questions that the FBI appears to be looking into involving how that switch was made by the Zahn administration. There's a civil case going on where Ramelli is suing the city for the way it handled the switchover, whether it was violating its contractual obligations. I had done stories back in 2020 about some of the concerns with services under Ramelli. Then there's been testimony in depositions that's catching the federal government's attention. And now, separately, there are issues with a specific employee under Zahn who's now been fired, Chad Pitfield. He was the deputy CAO when he was the head of the recreation department. He was involved in auditing the previous garbage contractor, helping to move it over to Torres's firm, and now there are questions about Torres payments. There was one time where Torres actually paid Pitfield $4,000 for the delivery of garbage cans to the citizens of Kenner during the switchover, and there's questions about, Torres says that was just simply a reimbursement for Pitfield paying for kids to do that work. But again, that's strange, to say the least, under a city contract for a garbage contractor to pay a city official. And then the FBI did come in with a subpoena to the City Hall offices that are now in the Macy's at the Esplanade Mall, and deliver because of Ida damage, and questioning things about Mr. Pitfield's payroll records, questions about $86,000 he was paid in disaster pay during and after Hurricane Ida, stretching for 4 months, and that was a huge increase of over 50% of his salary just in that time, and questions about whether he was double dipping and working at the same time as a deputy for the reserve deputy for the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office. So there's major concerns here that are a legitimate FBI investigation, but it's also really, powered by the political forces in play with a tough re-election campaign for Mayor Zahn.
Council members not all council members, but some council members are asking the mayor to step down.
Exactly, yeah. After the subpoena was served at City Hall, the very next day or 2 days later, I believe it was, in the last couple of weeks, the council voted, a majority of the council voted to call for Zahn's resignation, but it does not have the force of law, and Zahn said absolutely not, said it was a silly resolution that had no power, but pretty soon the voters of Kenner are going to have the final say, because they're going to be voting on March 26th.
Yep, it comes down to the voter. Real quickie.
I think that vote of no confidence, they're borrowing from the British parliamentary system, and this ain't Parliament. I mean, it operates totally differently.
Okie doke. Let's go on over. Thanks a lot, David. And let's stick with you right now. It is Mardi Gras time. So how are we doing so far?
So far, we're really doing well. I've been thinking through what the issues were that people were, concerned about. Of course, the first issue being, will there be parades? And obviously, there are. A major issue has been having to shorten the routes, and they have been. And we'll know after Carnival the impact of that. I mean, we are hearing stories like some streets, like especially around the Magazine Street area, that had businesses that really depended upon those Carnival parades that don't have them this year. And so we'll see the impact of that. There also may be another impact that we can't quite measure yet, and that is what it does to the crowd situation. Instead of dispersing the crowd, it may be jamming the crowds a little bit more. The parades I've seen, there have been good crowds, but not overwhelming. I mean, I wouldn't say that they're jammed, but it was, at a friendly level, and so things seem to be going okay. The parades seem whole. Now, the advantage that the crews have is that since they didn't parade last year, when they were told they wouldn't parade, some of them already were in progress with their parades, and so some crews had less to do in terms of getting their parades ready for this year. There was another concern about bands, and I know that there have been some dropouts with bands, especially out-of-state bands who, hearing about the COVID, but the parades I've seen, there have been a lot of bands, and so there's there. One area that continues to be growth, which I think is a good growth, is in the subgroups. There's little marching groups that go between the floats. And to me, I've always said those are almost more fun than the floats, and so the indications are good. The really big controversy in the first few days was with the crew of Nick's, which ran into a lot of trouble over the year. I know, Mike, you've been covering that story, and you might want to comment on it.
Yeah, who knew that a social media post by the Captain for Life, Julie Lee, would create such a firestorm of controversy at the time of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. She posted All Lives Matter. And then her crew, which was at up to 3,500 members, a good percentage, maybe even more than half African American, all female, of course, met with her and tried to get her to understand that at that moment, very inappropriate. And she would not, she tried to apologize, but she wouldn't say Black Lives Matter. And the result was mass defections. People dropped out left and right. The Knicks parade that rolled on Wednesday night was about 240 stated members. It might have been, less than 200 actual riders. So that is one of the steepest declines of, what had become the biggest crew by membership in all of Carnival, 3,500 down to 240. And the people who had watched the parade before at Druids, regular decent-sized crowd, left in droves. So you could see that there was almost sort of like a public consensus against Nix and some of those controversy swirling around that crew. There are certainly questions about whether that crew can continue to be continue to parade. It looked like they dipped below the required number of marching bands. You're supposed to have 7. They had 6 on their lineup. I understand 2 of those dropped out. So they were way under the requirements. And once again, it could all go back to that single post. Now that opened up this can of worms about some of the finances. Once again, all tied to Julie Lee, who kept kind of a close.
And let me mention that they were pretty proud of their ridership number, bragging about having more than 3,000. Having more than 3,000 is not necessarily good. I mean, it really doesn't do anything for your audience out there, doesn't do anything for the police who are protecting. And sometimes it causes some real problems if you don't have the right kind of accommodations and floats. And we heard stories of some people who dropped out just because they were so jammed. Imagine, if you have 3,000 riders, you got to put them in the floats, that some were so jammed that they felt like they couldn't even move around. And so they were just really affected by it.
Right.
So there were a lot of little problems out there.
And Julie Lee had a comp set of, take all comers. But what ended up getting exposed after the original controversy was her close control of the finances, and ended up in a big lawsuit alleging fraud and no accounting for the well over $1 million collected by Julie Lee.
All right, well, we have to move on, and we should also note there are parades happening outside of the city of New Orleans, too. Jefferson Parish has had its full lineup, and some on the West Bank and other parishes, too. So happy Mardi Gras to everybody. Okay, guys, thanks a lot. David, over to you. Sewerage and Water Board, always something coming from the Sewerage and Water Board.
Yeah, well, I did an investigation last year of the plumbing department and found that 2 of the top officials there, Jay Arnold and Vernon Marcotte, were involved in a web of self-dealing where they were signing off on certain plumbing permits, and then they were also getting contracts to do gas installation projects in the city, and the person inspecting that on many of those jobs was also a plumber. So it was a whole kind of circular process. And the day after I did that story, that very next morning, the FBI raided the Sewerage and Water Board to collect those paper-only documents that are kept in that plumbing department, only in filing cabinets. They don't have any digital records, so they actually seized all those records, the FBI did, as a part of an investigation that had been going on for a little bit. And that now has led to the Sewerage and Water Board firing Mr. Marcotte, and Mr. Arnold resigned this past week. So that concluded after an internal investigation backed up all of my findings from the report I did in November. Also, we're seeing that there's been a raise recently. I know a lot of people reacted strongly to the news that Ghassan Korban, the Sewerage and Water Board Executive Director, received a 9.5% raise to bring his salary to about $322,000 a year. That's about $57,000 more than when he was hired 3.5 years ago, which is a pretty steep incline in his salary in a very short period of time when a lot of people are seeing their salaries stagnant.
But city administrators supporting that, defending that.
Yes, absolutely. Certainly we've reported on a lot of controversies during his 3.5 years there, but certainly the controversies at the Sewerage and Water Board, many of them predate his arrival. And the Sewerage and Water Board Board of Directors, which is headed by the mayor, Mayor Latoya Cantrell, gave a full-throated endorsement for the raise for Mr. Korban.
All right, thanks a lot, Dave. Let's go back on over to Mike, because some people are getting charged for having to go get their cars that had been towed away after they had been carjacked and their cars stolen. And
I think City Council President Helena Moreno might have put it best, is it's like getting victimized twice. You have your car either stolen or carjacked. It ends up in a private tow lot for which you have to pay anywhere from $250 to $1,000 to get your car back. And what Helena Moreno found out was 2 things. One, she understood, because she helped author a state bill that is now law that parishes cannot force victims to pay to recover their stolen property. Well, that was not being followed in New Orleans. Nobody had ever funded that, and no victims, I guess, ever raised the issue and cited the law. So what she has introduced, along with Councilman Joe Geruso, I think Oliver Thomas in support of it, and J.P. Morrell also made a strong statement in support of funding an effort in New Orleans so that victims do not have to, pay for the tow and the lot to get their car back. Now, one thing that Helena Moreno found out when she was looking at how much money needs to be put aside to fund this effort, that there were some 1,640 cars that the city just called up the tow, operator on their vendor list to have it towed away at private cost. And that the money that she had originally proposed, $150,000, was not going to be nearly enough to cover that. So now they're looking at something closer to $500,000. Now, one other thing that I was able to uncover by following this one victim who did have to go get his car, pay $400 to get it back, it was full of items that were left from a carjacking spree, IDs, credit cards, and other valuable evidence.
Not the owners.
Left in the car. And he had to go, return this to the police where it was deemed valuable evidence. So by the police department allowing these cars to be towed away instead of going to an evidence cage, they could be losing valuable evidence that could be used to solve crimes, add charges, and return other people's property who had been victimized.
Yeah, interesting. All right, I know you'll be following up on that, and we'll see what happens. Will people be reimbursed if they've paid already and the city does come up with this fund? Can they apply to be reimbursed for those costs?
Yeah, and it looks like this will pass unanimously, and if they get the funding that they think they're going to need, $450,000 to $500,000, people who have already paid can bring all those receipts and presumably get that money back.
All right, well, that would be good. E?
When you get your car towed, and it's happened to me, okay, and you go and get it, it's some no man's land out on the back road out in eastern New Orleans. It's really scary out there. And even the attendant told me, this is really a terrible place to be, okay?
Well, let me tell you, with the and that's the city lot. The private tow lots are scattered all over the city. It's a long vendor list, and, people get notified and have to go to, some unfamiliar parts of town to get their car and then pay to get it back after they've been victimized.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Hopefully that will come to a change. Okay, David, let's go on over to you, because you, not too terribly long ago, you paid a visit to Ukraine.
Yeah, it was December 2019, and I had the honor and privilege of going to speak at an investigative reporting conference in Kiev. And I was invited because I've gotten to know some Ukrainian journalists quite well over the years. Some of them have come to actually visit here in New Orleans. And I studied Ukrainian history in college 25 years ago or so. And so I had a real interest in this and developed this relationship with those folks, and they invited me over there. And it's interesting now with the war starting and the invasion from Russia to see how it all ties together. I was struck by the kind of old Eastern Bloc architecture in Kiev when I was there. It was very dreary and rainy and gray. But, it's the breadbasket of Europe. It's a beautiful countryside outside of Kiev, and in parts of Kiev that are the older parts, there's some beautiful architecture. And then in western Ukraine, in cities like Lviv, which have never been part of the Russian Empire. They were part of Austria historically, medieval cities with cobblestone and beautiful architecture. And this is now under attack. All those cities are being shelled relentlessly by Russian forces.
Have you been able to get in touch with any of the folks that you met over there?
I have. I've been in touch with them in the run-up to this. Remember, there was very good intelligence this time, unlike other times recently, but the U.S. had very good intelligence this time that there was this attack being amassed by the Russian army and that this was imminent. And so I've been in touch with my colleagues over there to get updates, and they were very concerned and have been for a long time, and it was just this waiting game. And now that it's happened, they are hiding in bomb shelters regularly. The sirens are going off constantly. And one of my colleagues, Ole Kolmanok, who I interviewed this week on Channel 4, he's actually stuck outside the country, which may be a good thing for his safety, actually. But he was at a conference in Tbilisi, Georgia at the time, and has not been able to get back because there's no commercial air traffic into Ukraine.
Now, there had been a history of corruption in Ukraine in which journalists who helped bring about change.
Mr. Kolmanok, who I just mentioned, was actually leading a team into the presidential palace in 2014 when they uncovered troves of corruption by the former pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych, and he was forced to flee to Russia in 2014 because huge protests by Ukrainians in the central square there demanding to join NATO. So the democratic tradition has really grown very, very strong in Ukraine, and it was at that moment that Putin sent forces in and annexed Crimea, which is a key southern portion of Ukraine that is on the Black Sea and a key place for the fleet, for the Russian fleet to control. And then he sent arms and everything to the separatists in the eastern part of Ukraine. And that's that Donbas region that he initially went in and said he was sending peacekeeping forces into. And that was the launching point now for what we see, which is all-out invasion, all-out war for the first time in 80 years in Europe.
And it's just so sad and so concerning. All right, David, very interesting story. Thanks. Real quick, guys, other stories.
All it's even having an impact on our Mardi Gras. A fledgling cable news network, News America, was sending a crew here to cover Mardi Gras, and today it was announced that they're not going to come because of all the time they have to give now to covering the situation in Ukraine.
David.
Well, I'm just going to be keeping in touch with our friends in Ukraine and continuing to bring information about the way that this affects our country and our area here in New Orleans.
Mike, over to you.
Yeah, on a lighter note, there's quite a bit of drama surrounding the Pelicans, not necessarily so much on the court, but off the court, involving Zion Williamson. Still rehabbing from his broken foot, hasn't played a minute this season. And the big question is whether he even wants to be here. He'd been alienating a whole bunch of the fan base by being silent, but he just very recently posted something on social media that he's eagerly awaiting joining the team. So we'll see probably next season.
Okay. All right, guys. Thanks a lot for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a very happy and safe Mardi Gras. Have a good evening.
Informed Sources is made possible in part by Susie and Pierre G. Villery.
With a lifetime of passion for public television, we are pleased to help underwrite Informed Sources.
Please join us in supporting WYES TV.